Protected Speech with Ravi Kapur and Jonathan Choe.
Along with Jonathan Choe, I'm Ravi Kapur for another edition of Protected Speech. We're going to get into the big topics of this week. And Nishad Singh back in the news for pleading guilty in the FTX ongoing situation where FTX collapsed, this global cryptocurrency firm that was making their names very well known in the United States and abroad. He had FTX and their founder, Sam Bankman-Fried, had really become well known in political circles on both sides of the aisle, had funded sports arenas like down in Miami. Well, the whole enterprise has collapsed. And Nishad Singh, who was really part of that leadership, part of that triumvirate running FTX, decided to fold his cards and confess to the feds.
Yeah, this is obviously a terrible sign for Sam Bankman-Fried when his top lieutenants, his ex-girlfriend, and other allies are now looking out for themselves and looking for plea deals, and it's just not a good sign. Look, Nishad, by all accounts, a brilliant engineer. He was leading the tech component of FTX, but he got some pretty sizable loans from the company, hundreds of millions of dollars. We don't know where all of that is at right now, so it's going to be interesting when more details come out from this plea deal. But clearly, you don't make a deal like this unless you feel like the feds actually have something against you.
And of course, the federal government is working in cahoots with the Bahamian government since FTX was based in the Bahamas. But all these folks have ties to the Bay Area. They all got to know each other. Nishad Singh is someone we've been profiling on ViaTV for the better part of a decade. Just kind of a coincidence that he was an ultra marathoner, which is someone who can actually run like 100 miles at a shot, which is absurd. And so we did a story on him when he was a teenager before he went to UC Berkeley. It's pretty wild that, and frankly, we get pitched stories by parents quite often talking about their extraordinary teenager, in this day of college applications. Oh, what can I do to put my child ahead of the pack? And so we got this pitch, and he actually got profiled by a couple of other media outlets as well. But it was kind of an extraordinary to see this young man out there in the foothills in the Bay Area training. And then he went on to UC Berkeley to success and got to know Sam Bankman-Fried's brother, and that's how he got folded into the Alameda research firm that SBF ran along with Caroline Ellison, his former girlfriend, and then, of course, moving over to the FTX side. And, of course, FTX raised billions of dollars from some of the most preeminent investors on the globe, around the globe. And Nishad Singh, on the inside of all this stuff, ostensibly getting loans of $500 million plus. And so it's really quite a crash, a fall from grace, so to speak, to go from being this whiz kid who's part of this multi-billion-dollar enterprise and now to have to sit down and confess to the feds, hey, his role in this whole scheme. And we'll see long-term what the impact is on him and his career, but certainly he's going to have some, he's likely to serve a few years in prison.
Well, he's pleading guilty. Again, let me be very clear. He's pleading guilty to conspiracy and fraud. He's a criminal. So, I don't know if he's going to see any jail time, but I think that, the information he provides will be contingent upon that. But he's going to be paying, I'm sure, hundreds of millions of dollars in fines, restitution to the victims. But, it's going to be really interesting to see how this trial unfolds. And I'd love to be a fly on the wall, as Singh confesses and tries to beg for a plea deal. So we'll see.
Right, and Ellison also is working with the federal government. She was heading Alameda Research. So now that Ellison has confessed, Singh has confessed, SBF is holed up in Palo Alto. He's back with his parents, with an ankle bracelet on, sitting back as they prosecute him. It's going to be interesting to see. I really do want to see if they actually serve hard jail time and how long that is. Because oftentimes, first-time offenders, especially white-collar offenders, seem to get away with a lot of stuff, right?
Yeah, and Gary Wang, the other associate, a close confidant, he's also pleaded guilty as well. So the entire inner circle is collapsing, and Bankman-Fried's pretty much on his own. But you bring up a great point. Obviously, SBF's been called a mini Madoff in reference to Bernie Madoff, who ran arguably one of the largest Ponzi schemes in American history. So people are out for blood. They want to see Bankman-Fried, at the very least, go away for a long time. Some of his associates, I actually don't think they're going to actually see any federal prison time. I think they might see some home confinement, But like you said, they're not violent offenders. And the American justice system, the jails, the prisons are already clogged up. I think we're just going to see a lot of fines, and their names are going to be, and reputations are toast.
Well, again, I think that's the point. Can a white collar criminal fleece investors of that caliber, right? Like high caliber investors and the general populace who trusted this brand. Again, they were investing in, stadium naming rights, things of that nature. They had, Steph Curry and Tom Brady representing the brand among other celebrities. So this is widespread. They had political influence. I think they've got to serve some hard prison time for anyone to think, hey, can we just put up a big Ponzi scheme and get away with it just because we've bought off some politicians and got some celebrity endorsers? I think that's why they have to make a statement here. At least I'd like to think that, because we do know wealthy people oftentimes get away with stuff by paying the right folks. We've seen that happen.
Well, I think these wealthy people saw the writing on the wall, at least SBF's close associates like Singh. They know how serious this is. That's why they approach the feds, not the other way around.
We'll follow that story, and again, namely, how much of this money that they gave to the political leaders, because I know that there's been a push to document that, how much of that money is getting returned, because there is going to be restitution involved, and some of this money is still in these different, dark money, places that, money went to these different political institutions. That is also going to be interesting to follow. All right, we're going to move forward to another story of interest involving George Soros, someone that we have not covered on this show, and India, and namely kind of a war of words between Soros, who's this kind of elite banker, financier, someone who's, I think, well known in the American consciousness, but, he's an older guy, he's in his 90s, and kind of the boogeyman for certain people. I'm always reticent to talk about people who have made it to that level, because there are going to be haters, right, associated. You look at a guy like Bill Gates, people take shots at him, they take shots at Jeff Bezos, they take shots at Elon Musk, and understandably, these folks have leveraged the capitalist system at a level that very few have been able to do, and so they have outsized power, outsized influence. But Soros is unique in the sense that he's made money, and then he wields political influence in the United States and globally. And so we want to play a clip of what Soros said in reference to India. And then afterwards, we're going to play a clip of S. Jaishankar, the Indian Foreign Affairs Minister, who was discussing Soros after Soros made that statement. And I want to get your thoughts on their side, Jonathan.
India is an interesting case. It's a democracy, but its leader, Narendra Modi, is no Democrat. Inciting violence against Muslims was an important factor in his meteoric rise. Modi maintains close relations with both open and closed societies. India is a member of the Quad, which also includes Australia, the US, and Japan. But it buys a lot of Russian oil at a steep discount and makes a lot of money out of it. Reverting to India, Modi and business tycoon Adani are close allies. Their fate is intertwined. Adani Enterprises tried to raise funds in the stock market but failed. Adani is accused of stock manipulation, and his stock collapsed like a house of cards. Modi is silent on the subject, but he will have to answer questions from foreign investors and in Parliament. This will significantly weaken Modi's stranglehold on India's federal government and open the door to push for much-needed institutional reforms. I may be naive, but I expect a democratic revival in India.
Essentially, Mr. Soros said India is a democratic country, but he doesn't think the Prime Minister of India is a Democrat. by the way, a few years ago, in the same conference, I was there at that time, he actually accused us of planning to strip millions of Muslims of their citizenship, which of course didn't happen. It was a ridiculous suggestion. But you have to understand what this actually means. I could take a view that the individual in question, Mr. Soros, is a old, rich, opinionated person sitting in New York who still thinks that his views should determine how the entire world works. Now, if I could only stop at old, rich and opinionated, I would put it away. But he is old, rich, opinionated and dangerous, because what happens is when such people and such views and such organizations, they actually invest resources in shaping narratives. I spoke about globalization. Now, what globalization does is it actually creates a lot of the seamlessness of globalization, which creates all the opportunities, also allows narratives to be shaped, money to come in, foundations to go about their agenda. Now, in this particular case, it is very clear that he has very strong political preferences. He actually thinks that, doesn't matter that this is a country of 1.4 billion people, we are almost there, whose voters decide how the country should run.
So Soros and Jaishankar, with an exchange, frankly, that I've never seen before, especially a leader from India. Again, I hear Soros gets criticism in the United States. Obviously, there's always going to be people that take pot shots at people that have done as extremely well as Soros has done and the kind of political influence he has. But what do you make of Jaishankar going straight on for really one of these folks that has had an outsized influence around the globe?
I think what it shows is where India sees itself in this global conversation. India is arguably one of the superpowers in the world right now. And I think they also recognize that they're not going to allow someone like a George Soros, somebody who is not an Indian, come as an outsider to dictate the terms and the narrative of what India should be doing, how it should be behaving on the world stage, and what ultimately India's ideology should be about. And I think that's what it comes down to. Look, George Soros is not just your average billionaire. He's a major player when it comes to influencing media and certain, causes. You can say whatever you want about George Soros and be a critic of his, but look at what he's funding. He tends to fund, progressive causes. And you have a lot of folks who are moderates and also, on the right who don't like that. So he's clearly seen as an enemy. And, when he got in, bed recently in this fight with India, to me, that was a shocker. I've never seen or Soros go after India like this, especially the president, Prime Minister Narendra Modi like this. So clearly, I think there was some political equation to that.
Yeah, he did take shots at Modi a couple of years ago, and that's understandable because there's a lot of folks, in the United States and people that want to have.
But to this
influence.
degree, to go after Modi like this to this degree, and India.
Well, again, this is a constant criticism that American elites have, right? This is something you see in D.C. where India is targeted for human rights violations, quite frankly. And I do want to pull up a graphic which was put together by another organization. I haven't fully been able to go through this dynamic, but if you look at Soros there, this nexus, we've talked about some of the influential people in his circle. These are some folks that we have discussed on this program and throughout our network, frankly, folks that have a lot of say in what goes on in the United States, influencing the South Asian diaspora, and as well they have an interest in what's going on in India. And so Soros, ostensibly, according to Disinfo Lab, has funded directly or indirectly all of these people and all of these organizations, some of whom we've discussed on this show. And I think it demonstrates that the nexus that's been used is quite widespread. And I don't think it's well known. I think it's something that we're still kind of uncovering. Again, Soros has been criticized very heavily for his efforts in U.S. politics. For example, a lot of the district attorneys in places like San Francisco, where he was using organizations to fund some of these folks, like Chesa Boudin, who has now been ousted in San Francisco. But the extent through which he's investing in foreign government activity, I think that's pretty stunning. And I know folks have said that, okay, in the financial services realm, he's trying to put his hand on what goes on in Indonesia or what goes on in other countries. And we don't necessarily see that because you're not sitting there in the markets. The equity markets are dynamic and there's all these players that have influence in what's going on. But the fact that he's putting his money where his mouth is, where he's not happy with the Modi administration, and then he's funding opponents in the United States as well as in India, I think this is something to watch. And I think the key part is Jaishankar. I've never seen an Indian official go really kind of, in a very strong way, rebut what a Western influencer is doing. And I think that's what makes it so interesting.
He made pointed comments. He went for the jugular. I mean, I'm reading this quote right now. I'm going through the transcript here. And I'm actually fascinated, again, about this brewing dynamic. I've never personally seen it. You mentioned that Soros has taken shots at Modi. But when you have others now in Modi's administration speaking out like this, clearly they've been given the green light. And Jaishankar was quoted as basically saying that Soros's views essentially are from a Euro-Atlantic perspective, a white Western European view of the world. And I think India has had enough of that, especially with colonization and, trying to free themselves as a country from that narrative and all the consequences, the unintended consequences that's come along with that.
I think this is what's going to be interesting moving forward is we saw India and China have some flare-ups on the border, but China feels very strongly about colonization too. And I think this is where India and China, if they figure out their own dynamic, and I think, again, cooler heads have prevailed. They haven't, used malicious weapons. They're using like kind of prehistoric kind of weaponry there on the border. They're not trying to like shoot and maim people there. If they can figure this out, both countries resent other folks from the West and beyond trying to influence their borders and their politics. And I think that's another dynamic as, again, the West tries to influence China and tries to influence India. Both these countries are very strong now and are pushing back. And so we'll keep watching. All right, Jonathan has another exclusive story he's just broken involving really a tale of two cities. We see this, frankly, all over the world where, some cities have an approach that's different than, basically across the street. And Jonathan explains this dynamic going on in Washington State.
Yeah, and it's really happening in Olympia, Washington, the state capital, just minutes away from the governor's mansion, the Capitol building, all these halls of power. It just blows my mind. Just this time yesterday, I was driving down the highway, and there's this massive homeless encampment that's just exploding and spilling out into the street. And on one side of Interstate 5 is Olympia, where it's a total disaster. But you walk 100 yards over the bridge into the city of Lacey. It's sparkling. No tents, no homeless, no garbage. And what it comes down to, according to Lacey officials, is they've decided to simply enforce the trespassing laws. And how they did that was they actually approached the Washington State Department of Transportation, who owns these right-of-ways and has jurisdiction. And WashDOT, wasn't against that. So what it really comes down to is ideology. Olympia being criticized right now by many who accused the council and the mayor and the city manager of capitulating to the far left activists and having too much of a progressive policy where they see the homeless situation as only being solved with housing first, which means we're only going to move people from homeless encampments, even though they're doing drugs, robbing stores and overdosing on the streets, if there are apartments or studios, long-term stable housing. These congregate or shared shelter spaces are unacceptable. That's part of the progressive worldview and policy. Now, I get it. They want to make sure that it's long-term and sustainable, but it's not realistic when there's so many shelter spaces that are open and not being used, and the homeless are now refusing to go in. So it's this attitude of entitlement as well, right, among the homeless that the progressives don't want to talk about. But normal folks, the business owners, the people who have to live next to this are saying, what about our rights? What about the rights of the taxpayers? Why do we keep on, prioritizing the homeless when in many cases the homeless are rejecting the shelters and the services being offered? So it's really fascinating what's going on, and it's a story now that's kind of going viral right now.
And so you go to Olympia, you see what's going on there, and then right across the freeway, you have a different dynamic.
Yeah, and that's kind of our job as journalists, right? You go initially to a story, a tipster said, "Hey, you got to look at this crazy encampment that happens to share a fence line with this strip mall that includes big box retailers like Hobby Lobby, and there's a Starbucks there and a gas station and all these mom and pop shops." But then when I actually got to the ground, I was like, "What? How is it the other side is completely clear?" And then someone said, "Oh, that's a different city. That's Lacey." And right there, I mean, that is the dynamic. I think that's just journalism 101. Just to have that instinct, I immediately started calling officials. And interestingly enough, the folks in Lacey, including the police chief and a city council member, were gladly willing to tout their success and their willingness to actually enforce the law and support and empower their police department to lead this outreach with compassion. But in Olympia, they decided not to answer any of my questions on camera and only sent me a statement, pretty much that reads in part that they're working on it and they're looking for long-term solutions. So in other words,
when you say enforce the law, you're talking about enforce the state law?
yeah, this is what's crazy, man. There are trespassing laws on the books that say people are not allowed to camp on state right-of-ways, and the signs are up. And in my story, you see signs that say no trespassing. The problem is, depending on which agency or jurisdiction you're in, these laws are not always being enforced. So just because you have a law, if it doesn't get enforced, that means it's pointless. It has no teeth. So that's what this debate has been like here in Washington State. It comes down to ideology, how you want to enforce, when you want to enforce, who it applies to. And that's kind of where the accountability journalism has been coming in for me, to really expose the double standard, or ultimately how different jurisdictions and cities decide to interpret a law.
Now, Olympia is a capital city, right? So
Yep.
why aren't they enforcing what's going on right there in the state capitol?
Well, it's complicated. Again, you have a police agency in Olympia that's been sort of defanged. Again, the progressives all have been against the police department in the past few years because of the rise of BLM and defund the police movement. So the Olympia Police Department has essentially been told by city officials to stand down when it comes to homeless outreach. But in Lacey, it's been the complete opposite approach. They love the police, they support the police, and they know that not all police officers are bad people. And at the end of the day, they're all human beings. And they care about the homeless as much as the folks in Olympia. But again, the key is they trusted and empowered the police to go in first and also work with other agencies to make sure that the homeless carefully got into situations, but at the same time sent a strong message saying, look, the tough love here is we got to enforce the laws. We can't allow you to live in squalor and filth any longer. Would you allow your children? Would I allow my children to live this way? Absolutely not. And that's what the progressives and the far left failed to see.
Well, it's a challenging topic because obviously there's a lot of people who have compassion for these folks who are struggling on dealing with substance abuse, et cetera, family trauma. And at the same time, I mean, right across the way, there's a different approach. And, these people have to go somewhere.
Yeah, but it's working. And that's what's so stunning. You have data for Housing First, which is all about put people into apartments and studios and stabilize them. No strings attached, by the way. So if you're a drug addict, you're not required to get treatment. You only get treatment when you're ready, but we'll still give you all the harm reduction needles and pipes so you can do all the meth and overdose in your brand spanking new apartment. That data shows it's not working at the scale it needs to be working. But on the other side, when you go after the housing earned approach, actually enforcing the law and encouraging folks to take that next step, essentially intervening on their behalf, that's starting to work in Lacey.
Well, let's get into another horrific homeless crisis that took place in Seattle. I mean, in St. Louis.
St. Louis.
It's one of the most reprehensible videos that I've come across, and I'm actually surprised we're doing this story because it's so heinous. But we do want to play this video just in brief. We're not going to show you the whole clip of this poor man in St. Louis basically getting executed right there on the street. I'm actually kind of still stunned at how grisly it is, and kind of ties into what people on the street are dealing with, which is part of the reason we're highlighting this kind of stuff, because sadly we have some bystanders who are actually filming this and giving their own kind of commentary while this gentleman here on the street is basically loading a weapon ready to kill this, I don't know if he's unsuspecting, but certainly kind of oblivious homeless man that's right there. I don't even know what to say about this, Jonathan, but I know you had some thoughts. It's just horrific that this is taking place here in this day and age.
Yeah, shocking, stunning, unacceptable, and it just goes to show you we cannot allow the homeless to live on our streets. We cannot allow America's streets to become slums and our asylums. We need intervention. And, by all accounts, according to authorities, the victim here is named Daniel Saldana, a homeless man, got into some type of altercation with the shooter, the alleged shooter, Deshaun Thomas. Thomas was arrested without incident, down the street after the shooting. But, man, the cold-blooded, brazen nature of this, broad daylight. And you see in the video, and again, I want to make sure, I don't get too graphic, but just the fact that, Thomas just calculating, taking the time to put in the clip into the gun and then to cock it back and then just to shoot like you're shooting an animal. I don't even know if you shoot your dog or another pet that way. You did a human being, and then you see, Saldana just hunch over. One of the saddest stories, but it's so important. Again, I wanted to play it, and it's a story I've been covering as well out here, just kind of from a distance, getting feedback on social media. People absolutely outraged. But at the same time, again, this is the argument for we got to get people off the streets. We can't allow this. There has to be intervention.
I mean, you're in the middle of these situations all the time. I think it's part of the reason we're highlighting the story. And again, just horrific, heinous crime, which, it's not just one person that's getting shot in cold blood. It happens, frankly, a lot in this country and all over the world. But in terms of this particular situation, you have a man there on the street. What's the protocol for bystanders? I mean, again, you're out there documenting. I've seen you put yourself in harm's way more often than I think you should. You have a couple people, in a sense, kind of giving color commentary a little bit about what's taking place. What's the protocol? Should they just get off the phone and call 911? I mean, what?
I mean, look, what do you expect people to do? What can they do when there's a guy who has a pistol pointed at another man's head? Are you going to jump in, Kapur, and intervene? What can you do? Hopefully you would call 911. I mean, I wouldn't advise sticking around even for something like that. But the fact that they were recording, I mean, I think it's just curiosity. And in this day and age with the rise of cell phones, everyone has an iPhone or, it's ubiquitous. So it's one of those moments that was unfortunately captured. But I thought it was really important just to show what's really happening, the raw realities on the streets of America. This is America, not a third world country. This is St. Louis in the Midwest. To happen in this region, in this manner, I mean, my God, we're seeing the collapse of society. We need to be talking more about this. I think a lot of news orgs have kind of shied away or they wanted to go away, but I want to go directly into this and talk about this. How did we get to this point where there's this guy pulling out his pistol, and then, just in broad daylight, pulling the trigger? Have you seen anything like this?
I mean, honestly, I would say yes, because I see people have skirmishes, right? You spend enough time on social media, which unfortunately we do, because we're trying to find out what's going on news-wise, and so you come across videos where you have skirmishes, and then people brandish a weapon, and boom, somebody gets shot, and it's horrific, and then people are running away. So I can't say that I haven't seen
in that situation. You had your phone out, you seeing everything unfold. What would you have done?
Well, look, I think you and I almost inherently want to document what's going on, right? That's, I think, where we're at. But I think you'd want to do it from a distance where you're not at point-blank range. I mean, this video is effectively almost at point-blank range, right? They're probably maybe 15, 20 feet away. I don't know if they were behind a window or if they're in a restaurant or something like that. It seemed like they were kind of in a safe spot to film that, but
it appears they were behind some type of glass or something.
It's just horrific. I mean, I would say call the police and then obviously continue to document it if you can, if you could do both at the same time.
Yeah, but yeah, again, I want to say once again, while the data suggests that these homeless encampments attract crime and drug use, and criminals live in the midst of these tent cities, um, the vast majority, I would say, of the homeless out in the streets become victims in so many different ways through violence, robberies, sex trafficking, and murders. So, I think that's really important to get out there that, again, as a society, we can't allow this to continue.
Well, I think some of these public safety concerns, which we've highlighted, I think will have a direct impact on where things are going politically in this country. We've mentioned Chesa Boudin on this episode, who was booted out of San Francisco as a district attorney. But we also just saw that the mayor of Chicago was also escorted off the premises. Lori Lightfoot won't even go to, they're going to have a runoff. Two other people actually ended up with more votes than she has as the incumbent, which is like remarkable. So she basically, and I will say this just to give some context, her administration was there during the middle of COVID, so she had very little time to potentially establish anything that perhaps she had planned from day one. But I mean, you know Chicago well. I know Chicago.
Yeah,
We broadcast in Chicago. The public safety crisis in Chicago is real, and I would love for you to explain this to people about the dynamic in the different neighborhoods. Because I know years ago when we were both working for mainstream outlets, you called me up once on a Saturday night in Chicago and you're like, Ravi, I just covered this ridiculous story of like, I don't know if the number was 90 people getting shot, but it was something so ridiculous that I actually went to my newsroom. I said, hey, my friend just called me from Chicago. Like 90 people got shot in Chicago tonight.
You don't
Can
bat
you
an
cover
eye.
this? And they told me, hey, it's not on the Associated Press wire yet, so we can't go with your friend's reporting. And I'm like, I trust my friend's reporting. He's there on the ground. But this is not a new thing. So I don't want to point this just at Lightfoot, but I do think public safety has kind of unraveled in a lot of cities for many, many years. And it's coming to a head now because you have social media, you have videos, you have commentators, you have obviously people with political ideology. But break down Chicago briefly, because I know you have a lot of context with that and how it relates to what you're seeing in Seattle and what this tragedy that took place in St. Louis.
Well, sadly, like you said, a lot of the violence, inner city violence, was happening even before Lightfoot's, administration. So she inherited a hot mess. But the difference this time around, and it's a really astute point you picked up on, is in the past, a lot of the gang violence, the shootings were confined to inner city neighborhoods, predominantly black or Hispanic neighborhoods on the west side and south side of Chicago. Now that violence and insanity is pouring out to the Gold Coast, Michigan Avenue, the main tourism hotspots. And in the St. Louis video as well, this is like a downtown St. Louis area where this happens in broad daylight. So there are no longer boundaries for violence. And yeah, public safety absolutely is the top priority and should be for all mayors in American cities. But for Lightfoot, I don't know what she was talking about on her way out, but she blamed her demise on her race. She's a black woman, and of course she's openly LGBTQ. So again, I think her headspace wasn't always in the right place. She got too woke and progressive and lost sight of ultimately what the city of Chicago really wanted, first and foremost, and that was, again, public safety. And that's something that she wasn't, known for.
Yeah, I will say from afar, since I haven't really spent much time in Chicago in recent years because of the pandemic, but we do broadcast there. It's one of our hubs. I think the optics for her were terrible for all these years. She just did not look like she had command of what was going on, just at least visually. And to this degree, I think you're going to see London Breed, who's another black female mayor in San Francisco. She's going to have a tough time explaining away all these maneuvers in San Francisco. I think a little bit difference is that her pandemic response in the city of San Francisco's pandemic response, by most measures, was very strong. But the homeless crisis has gotten out of control, and the public safety issues have gotten out of control. And so she's going to have a real battle on her hands whenever if she decides to try to get reelected.
Yeah, she's in trouble too because she's dealing with an info war too now. When you have partners at private equity firms putting out New York Times op-eds, like one came out this past weekend, saying San Francisco is failing because of the minority fringe progressive policies and the far left activists influencing everything. And it's happening in Seattle too, in Portland. This is what happens: urban decay and disarray.
All right, we're going to get into our topic that we cover weekly, which is Asian American related hate crimes. Another issue that that came across this week, and I thought you found it interesting. The View had a discussion about the impact that President Trump had on what they're labeling as xenophobia, and I think you and I have had discussions about this over the years. But I'm really curious about the impact. And by the way, this segment is presented by the California State Library. We appreciate their support because it gives us a forum to talk about things with full context. I mean, oftentimes we're talking about specific crimes that happen, which have been horrible to report and document. But I think this conversation should take place about, the political rhetoric that's going on. And you on this program, point out, political folks that you don't really see eye to eye with. And I think certainly we have seen a spate of hate crimes towards Asian Americans connected to the pandemic. We've never seen this huge spike, which is part of the reason we want to showcase this. But I'm curious to get your sense about this particular angle, and is President Trump the end all be all when it comes to xenophobia?
Well, again, this is in the news again, and it got my attention because they were discussing it on The View with Whoopi Goldberg, Sonny, I believe it's pronounced Jostin, and the rest of the crew on The View. And the reason why, China and COVID's back in the news is that there are now some federal agencies, including the FBI, I believe, that's now, giving validity to this theory that the COVID-19 virus was leaked from a Wuhan laboratory. And at the time this happened, looking back, President Trump kept referring to it as the China virus. And, a lot of his allies had no problem with that. Of course, I want to add majority white. But for the Asian American community that was in the middle of, not only these COVID lockdowns decimating their businesses in Chinatown, they were dealing with, Asian hate. Right? People told to go back home. People were being called the China virus, being spit on. And, I even reported on that up until just a few months ago, happening here in Seattle, that type of language. Trump was blamed for a lot of the rise of Asian hate because of his rhetoric. I think Whoopi Goldberg recently said, well, if Trump had simply said, it was from a leak out of a lab, out of China, rather than using the flair that President Trump likes to use by calling people names or using slogans and phrases like China virus, that the Asian American community wouldn't have been targeted as much. But in hindsight, the reason why I wanted to talk about it today is that once again you have this show called The View. Not a single Asian American person is on this panel. So what I wanted to point out is that Whoopi Goldberg in no way speaks for the Asian American community. And while I do appreciate what she had to say about Trump, potentially, well, in her words, she blames him still to this day. I would go back and simply say, show me the data, okay? Instead of going with the mass herd, show me the data that Trump's language actually led to a spike in all these Asian hate crimes. And to this day, I have yet to see that, number one. Number two, who's ultimately the authority on this, or the organization or the media voice that gets to determine the narrative on this, okay? And that's the problem I have. And I wanted to chime in about that because in hindsight, I would say Trump, and his language, his rhetoric may have contributed to some of it, but it would be unfair and unrealistic to say that it was all because of Trump.
Yeah, I mean, talking about President Trump's legacy as president is really hard to just deduce in a soundbite because I think he had a lot of outsized influence on a lot of people, right? You have folks that are being outspoken about topics that they just weren't talking about before, right? So when it comes to this particular aspect, I think there are going to be people who say that Trump is the reason that we have this spate of hate crimes and a rise. But there is that kind of sense as well that, the Chinese government had something to do with this outbreak that affected the whole globe. So, Trump is tying into this kind of populist movement. When it comes to showcasing data, I think the data does show that we've had a rise in hate crimes. Now, can you tie it all to President Trump? No, I don't think you can do that. No. But can you tie it to rhetoric that was used? I mean, I think very famously, we have a friend and colleague that works at CBS News as a White House correspondent who basically called out President Trump to his face during a press conference about, his use of using the word China. So I think in the heat of battle during that time, you had a lot of people in the media that really detested Trump, right? And Trump, meanwhile, was tapping into a part of America that was very irate about political correctness and about the way some of this is going on. I mean, listen, you're covering stuff in Seattle. I think there's a lot of people that are compassionate about folks that are out down on their luck when it comes to the homeless situation. But you're calling out the fact that public safety is also affecting everybody, the common man.
And also,
so I think these are the balances politically.
Men or women sitting in their feces, or allowing them to overdose on fentanyl in an encampment instead of intervening. Is that compassionate? So it's all about your definition and how you define something as compassion, which goes back to this as well.
Right. So again, we have this balance. I think the challenge we have is that because we have these extremes on the far left and the far right, and most of us are in that 80% in the middle, right? So you have these 10% fringe elements. These people get all the oxygen. They make all the noise. They get all the headlines. We're talking about it here. But most of us are not on the edges. And I think that's the issue, is that when you start to see these issues affect those of us in the middle, I think that's when change happens. So this is why Lori Lightfoot getting the boot in Chicago is a big story. Why Chesa Boudin getting the boot in San Francisco as DA is a big story. What's going to happen to other folks along these lines? Meanwhile, we thought the Republicans were going to have a huge run-up in this previous election, and they did not take this overwhelming majority of the House. They do have a majority, but it's minute, and the Democrats solidified their majority in the Senate. So I don't think Americans want to be on the far right or the far left. At least the data tells me that most of us are in that middle. And so there's been experiments on the far left. There's been experiments on the far right, right? We have extremists on both sides that are actually in major political office, that are sitting in Congress, that are sitting as mayors, that are sitting as governors. And that's what makes this democracy fascinating, is that it's a giant experiment. But I agree with you in the sense that, show me the data. We talked about the caste issue. The data is the issue, right? No one's saying that discrimination doesn't take place.
Not just the data. The headline here is that the mainstream media has failed once again, and they're trying to dictate the terms on who the important voices are to this conversation. And that's the point I'm making right now. The View, Whoopi Goldberg, the rest of them, they're entitled to their own opinion, but they don't represent the entire Asian American community, especially when they don't have a single Asian American person on their panel. And now they're trying to opine and look back and play Monday morning quarterback and say, oh, well, it's all because of Trump again? No, absolutely not. You don't get to dictate that. Regardless, look, I want to say for the record, I think some of Trump's rhetoric, if I were advising, I would say, hey, dude, you don't want to say that. But for all the reasons you said, the fact he's a showman, the fact that he's trying to mobilize his base, and so on and so forth, yeah, he did that. But that's not the only reason for the rise in Asian hate. A lot of the stuff that, again, hasn't been talked about or dissected in the mainstream media, which our democracy relies on, no one was really talking about the fact that a lot of this racism, this underlying jealousy from the folks targeting these Asian Americans have always been there, not to mention the mental illness component and so on and so forth. So it's not just because of Trump. And that's the argument that I'm making. I think it'd be completely irresponsible just to blame one person's talking points to say that's the reason why Asian Americans have been having their heads bashed in. Because guess what?
I will say
Trump's
this.
no longer there. We're not hearing about China virus, and Asian hate is still happening. Why is that?
That's a good point, but I will say this. Trump used Twitter in a way that none of us have seen before, and he was putting stuff out there on a regular basis that drove people bonkers, right? Don't forget, he's the president. The president has a bully pulpit like no one else.
And
he
let
could
me
tell
say
you
this.
and
What
I to
about
show up
this
to the White House,
president?
and we would.
Is this president, or is the mainstream media condemning Asian hate or even covering Asian hate? Why do you think we have a segment? That's my point, because no one else is doing it.
I think this president, who just, by the way, nominated a cabinet secretary, the first Asian American member of the cabinet, Julie Su, I think this, again, the state of California realizes it. It's the first state to actually put together basically an AAPI equity budget, investing, basically $150 million plus in bringing Asian Americans to the table to talk about these issues. So that's why this segment exists, and we're appreciative of that. But I think California's ahead of the curve. I certainly think other states should be investing in their communities of color, but not just to deal with minor issues, because these are significant issues that are underlying, that don't get discussed. And do we need to have Asian Americans at the table? More people at every level of government? We do need that. And I think we're going to see more of this, by the way. We're going to see infighting. Again, one of the stories we covered on this show, we had 2 Asian Americans do a horrific mass shooting in California.
And that barely got any coverage.
It got very little coverage. Asian Americans were affected by it, but it got a little bit of coverage. It was a blip.
And then my entire argument, the 2 places where Asian Americans need to be focusing all their resources, media now and academia. It's not even politics, dude. They look to the politicians that I know now are looking to the media and to academia to get their data to serve their constituents. I'm telling you right now, we're in the right space, but that's the argument I'm making. Right now, you have outsized influence from folks like The View who have no idea what they're talking about, have one segment, a slice of this perspective and an opinion, and folks like you and me can't chime in or debate them. And that's the point, and it's going to die in the news cycle. But this is an important story, and I wanted to simply bring up again the importance of having different Asian American perspective, voices, and worldviews.
I would say this. I think The View's impact on our society is nominal, and I think it's going down. We are in a fractionalized media environment, Jonathan. You and I both know that when you're getting the kind of viewership you're getting on Twitter, and you see the
now
viewership
TikTok.
I mean, look, I'm playing. I'm going to say something in, it's kind of inside baseball, but like when sports leagues have entire networks that are about to dissolve because people have stopped watching a lot of these things and they don't want to subsidize some of these kind of billion-dollar sports any longer, like literally multiple enterprises are collapsing. The whole media ecosystem has changed fundamentally forever, and people are consuming content in different ways. Hopefully they can find us through all these different channels that we put the show out there. Absolutely. So I would say, with respect to the ladies of The View who have had, I think, an impact for a couple decades, their impact is lessening. And I will say this, the point you made is strong. We do need to have Asian American voices on that platform. And in their management, it'd be really nice if we had some Asian Americans in management and maybe a few Asian American owners. It'd be really nice to actually help to get some of us out there to support all these ecosystems for those of us that actually believe in diversity of thought and opinion and actually have real conversations about what's going on in our society. But that's going to wrap up this edition of Protected Speech. For Jonathan Choe, I'm Ravi Kapur. We will see you again next time.